Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first issue or the first edition of the Acadiensis Podcast. This is a new venture wherein we will be discussing historical matters and chatting with historians of the Atlantic region. This will be an ongoing series. We are looking for any historians who might be interested in having a chat with me. So if you are, please get in touch. Our first guest has generously joined us from Sackville, New Brunswick. He's one of my favorite people in all of academia, Andrew Nurse. Hi, Andrew. Welcome to the first episode of the Acadiensis Podcast.
Well, thanks so much, Corey. Yeah, I appreciate the kind words. And you, too, are one of my favorite people.
Well, thank you. This is becoming a bit of a love-in already. I guess the first question I'd have for you, Andrew, is where are you from? What's your background? What brought you to the study of history?
So I was thinking about that in terms of path to history, but also in terms of place. And, so I'm from Atlantic Canada. My family's from Newfoundland, Grand Bank, Newfoundland. And I grew up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, now in the HRM, and went to Dalhousie University for my undergraduate. And, history is one of those things. I was asked that same question one time by Andre Ediger with regard to her Unwritten Histories blog that she was running. And I don't have a particularly good reason why I got into history or what led me into history originally, other than the fact that it seemed particularly important. And as you're sort of calculating what you're doing and where you're going to go and the kinds of answers and information and knowledge that you're thinking about, history was a way of engaging the world and understanding the world that made sense to me. It got me up to now, and also helped to explain a range of different things like underdevelopment or conflicts between communities or uneven development or misogyny or sexism in society and those kinds of things. So history seemed, and the instructors that I had, the people who I took courses with, also seemed to be really interested in the same questions.
Are there any people who were formative scholars in your development that you could?
There's a
When
couple.
you talk about these scholars that you took classes with, are there any that come to mind that you want to mention?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a whole bunch of colleagues too who I think unknowingly play a role in people's development, in the ways we think about the past, how we interact with each other. And so just we were talking earlier today about a colleague of ours, John Reed, and certainly John, I didn't take courses with him, but as a model of effective research, of engaged research, of thinking critically about issues relating to commemoration or treaty rights, about the nature of transcontinental or transnational history. He was certainly a person who's continued, that I've had the opportunity to work with in the Acadiensis and other areas, who played a big role in demonstrating and modeling what it meant to be an effective historian, to be a good historian who was contributing to the society around them. But I was thinking about this the other day. I was driving to a teaching and learning conference, and I remembered I was talking about taking a seminar called Violence and Order in 20th Century Canada with Ruth Bleasdale at Dalhousie University. And Ruth came in, I liked her, and she came in, she lived around the corner from us when we lived on Roby Street, and said, so why does violence occur? What happens? Like, what makes people violent, or why does violence happen in society? And as undergraduates, we stammered a bunch of answers. We weren't ready to talk on the first day and things like that. But we ultimately decided that violence was an unusual situation, that people weren't naturally violent, then that violence occurred because of a series of unfortunate, unforeseen, or regrettable kinds of events. And I remember she said, my goal is to try to convince you that violence is actually a normal part of our system, that the system itself is violent, and it's violent every day. And the fact that you don't see it is something you need to interrogate. Would you say the same thing? She didn't use this example, but today we would say, would you say the same thing if you were the child of a survivor of residential schools? Would you say the same thing if you were part of a Black heritage heritage community in the Maritimes? Would you say no, things that violence is unusual, or would you say, well, gee, I hope it's unusual, but the experience of day-to-day racism, as my friend Jim Michael used to call it, um, that kind of experience isn't a form of violence and doesn't affect you. And that was a moment where it was like, wow, my eyes opened. And, in teaching and learning, we call these threshold concepts. So when you hear it, you walk through it, you can't look at the world the same way. And then the other person who I'd really say was a real formative influence on thinking, but also on how do you behave, was Michael Cross, the late Michael Cross, and just a wonderful human being, but a caring man. And he modeled for me the kind of idea that you can be a professional, you can be a historian, you can be engaged, but you shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we do have a burden of care, that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. And that's part of the lessons that I want you to learn.
Uh, Michael Cross is one of those. He's someone who I never got the opportunity to meet, but I've never heard anybody speak ill of him at all. He seems like a wonderful person and a top-rate scholar.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Both. Just as I said, just a kind individual, but a really insisting that you do the work too. He
yeah.
was my honors supervisor, and I remember myself and the other honors students would take some time and we would read up, and we'd come to our weekly meetings. He had weekly meetings, insisted on them, and there was a reading list, and we would quiz each other before we went, and it would take him about 3.5 minutes to take our arguments apart. Now, he wasn't being mean. What he was trying to do was to show us how do you actually think about this issue, right?
Yeah.
And I can remember we had read David Rothman's The Discovery of the Asylum, a book that still sort of haunts my memory. And and we were talking about humanitarianism, and he sort of looked at the group of us and said, "Humane to whom?" And so he was putting history in a system of social relations and asking us to think about how being kind and caring to one group of people might actually be the converse to somebody else, might end up being oppressive and marginalizing. And that was, an important lesson to learn. But the way he analyzed issues and the rigor he brought to it was another lesson.
Well, speaking of other lessons, you finished your degree at Dal, and then you chose to head off to Central Canada to go to Queen's University. What brought you to Queen's? What was it about Queen's
I
that
was
made
Ian
you want to apply there?
I was Ian Mackay's research assistant. He had been the second reader on my honors thesis, and he left the Maritimes to go to Queen's, and I was looking for a summer job, and I was working at the Nova Scotia Archives part-time and had some other part-time jobs, and I did some work for him, and I mentioned that I was looking to go to grad school, and he said, "Well, why don't you come to Queen's?" So I applied and was accepted, and it was a personal connection. I had taken the time to sort of do a little bit more reading in his work at that point in time before I applied, but it was a charge. It was a gas. He was another really um, kind and caring individual who lost nothing in the rigor of what he was doing.
That's good. And you did your MA and your PhD with Ian?
Yeah. Yeah, I did.
Oh,
I completed my MA. The late George Rawlick was on my MA committee. I have fond memories of George. He of course was Ian's, best friend in the department. They were close friends. And George was once I had met him, my son had just been born, and he would come down if I was busy and offer to take my son for a walk in his stroller. And so I was like, this is a really good bunch of people, right? These are really kind and individuals. But when I was defending my master's thesis, uh, people are asking you questions, and George asked me a question, and his first question was, Andrew, don't you think chapter 2 is completely wrong? Because he was fairly aggressive in the way he asked questions. And one of the other examiners, a man named Harold Ma, who I wanted to mention again at the end if we get a chance, said, "No, no, George, Andrew's right, and here's why." And he sort of went back at him. And so then the moderator looked at me and said, "Well, would the candidate like to say anything?" And I said, "Well, I agree with him," right? Like, and so then George said, all right, I grant that point. And he said, but chapter 3, it's about, Walter Abel and blah, blah, blah. And the moderator said, "Hey, I knew Walter Abel personally, and Andrew's got him down to a T." And so George said, "Well, I'll skip that one." And so then he said, "Well, I don't think you need chapter 4 at all." And Ian then said, "Oh, come on, George, how do you write on this subject without chapter 4? And George said, "I don't have any more questions."
It sounds like it might have been the easiest defense ever. You just sat back and let them go at it, and
I was scared. I was
no
scared going
doubt.
at it. Yeah, but I did not say very much during the defense at all. And later when I had my field exams, there was a similar moment where two of the examiners, in a very friendly way, disagreed with each other about the substance of a question. And it was pleasant. It was really engaging scholarship. But yeah, so I did both my MA and my PhD at Queen's. My MA was on sort of a group of artists, and then my PhD was on a guy named Marius Barbeau, who is a folklorist and anthropologist. Francis Slaney has a new book out on him that's really in depth and provides a real deep dive into the way he looked at the world. What I was exploring at the time with my PhD thesis was how something becomes traditional and how something becomes authentic, right? So we hear these words, this is traditional, this is authentic. How does it get to be that? And who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to decide what an authentic Indigenous culture is, and what happens to an Indigenous culture if you take it from its place of being a living and dynamic culture within a community and stick it in a museum? What kinds of new signifiers are attached to it, and what are the politics of those? Today, I would use a different language. We'd use a different language to describe those processes that I didn't have then. But I really, I would say I enjoyed the work, but it was a challenge, right? Yourself, like day after day after day, and getting revisions back and having to work through it. But there was a good cohort, some great Atlantic Canadian historians. Alan McEachern was around, Jeff Bryce, a non-Atlantic Canadian historian. But in geography, Brian Osborne, who did a lot of work on public history, Linda Jessup in the fine arts department. So there was a really, really interesting, and Harold Ma, as I said, a really interesting group of people around who were challenging and engaging.
That sounds great. It sounds like a good cohort.
I think I got a really good
Yeah.
education. It's one of the things that, as I teach now and think about the scholarship of teaching and learning, which is sort of also on my list if we have time to get to it, um, is that I received a very good education. There's all kinds of reasons why a person gets a good education. We know a lot more about that now than we did. We know that, I had a middle class background. I had a very supportive family. When I went to graduate school, I was married and had a loving and supportive wife, and all those kinds of things partner with me, who's encouraging and all those kinds of things, making a difference versus somebody else. The idea of building an education off sound pedagogical relationships where you're not buddy buddy. I was never buddy buddy with any of these people, right? But you're in the way, say, Bill Parento was good friends with Ernie Forbes, right? They provided a model, and it's a model I continue to try to implement.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense to try and be um, an effective mentor to your
Yeah.
students, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily best friends with them, but you can be friendly with them all the time. Like you can
Yeah,
be a generally engaging and generous scholar and teacher.
I think you've got it entirely. Like, those are the things you want to be with your students, with your colleagues, with people who contact you. You want to be generous, and you want to be friendly. You want to behave the way you would want people to behave towards you. And I can imagine Michael Cross, who had a really nifty series turns of phrases and things like that. But I can remember, like, I would think he would say something like, "I didn't educate you to be an idiot." Like, I think that's how he would explain it. Like, "I didn't put the time and energy into you for you to go off and be mean to somebody else."
Yeah. Good advice.
Yeah.
Uh, so now you're up to the point where you've defended your PhD at Queen's.
Yeah.
Now what? What you know?
So right at the end of my PhD, I've defended it, and it was, the defense itself was fun. It wasn't quite as much fun as the MA. And there were sort of, there was a new person whose name even eludes me now, who they'd had to sub into the committee late in the day because somebody was sick. And I could watch him, like, looking at his notepad. He went last. Queens was very hierarchical in the way they did things. And he went last, and I could see him scratching off his questions as other people asked them. And I could see he was down to the end of his notepad and he had none. And he asked a question. Said, "So, you've made a lot of use of a particular theoretical framework. Are you sure this is good? And, has this helped you?" And I said, "Look, I'm sorry. I tried to answer that question already when it was asked earlier. If you could tell me what I've done to ineffectively answer that question for you, I might be able to re-engage." He goes, "No, I liked your answer." And then he goes, "Well, what does this have to do with the Cherokee?" And I said, "Nothing. Like, I've not even read at that point in time on the history of the Cherokee. I thesis is focused on other things." And he went, "Yeah, it is." He goes, "I studied the Cherokee." And then he sort of tagged off. But the funniest thing in that defense, and I'll skip onto the question in a second. Keith Walden was one of the externals, and he started by saying, "Okay, you've made a series of claims and your thesis is based on cultural analysis. I want to know if you have any empirical evidence that can sustain the cultural claims you're making." And I did. And it was been incredibly hard to tease it out, to create data out of this stuff. So I said, "Look, I've got it. It's not in the thesis because it didn't fit with the narrative. But, right, let me tell you a little bit about it." And he goes, "I don't want to hear it. I just wanted to know if you had it." So then at the end of the thesis, Harold Mockink comes up to me, and I got another thing to say about him too, but he comes up and he goes, "Look, you should probably look for a studies program to go into as a profession." And I said, "Why not history?" He said, "I think what you're doing is history. These people think what you're doing is history, but your history is all taking place in the present, and it's about the past, right? It's about how the past is constructed in the eyes of the present." And he said that won't actually fly with a bunch of history departments. Now, we know today it would,
Yeah.
right? But that was one of the distinctions. So he said you should probably look at a studies program. So I applied to Mount Allison and in the Center for Canadian Studies, where I now teach, Center for Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Mount Allison. And I got I received a 2-year fellowship, and I received that initially, again, a chain of unusual circumstances. I wasn't their first pick. Somebody else was. They turned it down. And they picked me. Then they offered it to me. The guy ahead of me in line was Ray Blake, who has, of course, done some incredible work on Newfoundland history, and has just won the Governor General's Medal, and well deserved. And Ray was another sort of wonderful mentor and person who could direct you towards things and help you out. And he left to go to the University of Regina, and so they had this open spot job I'd been doing for about a year and a half, and sort of got it that way. I also know that there was a candidate. I won't give any names because I wouldn't want to embarrass anybody and things like that, who they interviewed, who I would have picked them instead of me. It might be the way of saying it. And I don't actually know why they didn't.
Oh. Well, I think it's good for both you and for Mount A that they went in the direction they did.
Yeah. It's been a good career. So since then, just to very, very quickly update, I've had Mount Allison has been a good home. Like many universities, it's going through a lot of turmoil right now. I think you guys might be a nick ahead of us in terms of the turmoil timeline in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
But certainly there are problems, and those are problems that we're going to have to address. And the restaffing of the humanities, of history, English, philosophy is going to be one of those issues where we need to figure out how do we address that under a situation of remarkably constrained
Yeah.
resources, and that's going to be a real challenge. Um, but my own research has sort of evolved since then, and it's evolved in a couple of ways. I've become more focused on Atlantic Canada. I got became involved with Acadiensis through the late Bill Parenta, who asked me to be part of the editorial board originally. I had been associate editor of the Journal of Canadian Studies before that, and so I was excited about that opportunity. And my own research sort of focuses right now on what was called alternate journalism, or what we call alternative or independent journalism, in the 1970s in Nova Scotia, in particular in Halifax. And I've also been looking at civic activism and participatory democracy in the same location in Halifax. So that's sort of where my research is now, and the focus of it. And also too, one of the big changes has been being involved with Acadiensis, and I was hoping I could say a quick word about that.
Oh, certainly. Go ahead.
So not to so as I'm on the board still, and I spent 5 years, I believe, as co-editor, and you have a much longer tenure as digital editor. Uh, but one of the things about Acadiensis that I really liked, and again, people like John Reed set the mark for this, but also Sasha Malawi and Suzanne Morton, who I'd like to sort of acknowledge as well, of thinking about how do we respond to colleagues' scholarship? And one of the rules that Acadiensis has used has been to try to approach things other than a peer review yes, no, to try to create a space where work is brought up to a standard as opposed to rejected.
Yeah.
And I think that is just an incredibly generous and important way to approach it, particularly for people who are new scholars. And
Yeah.
I really love the way in which Acadiensis too focuses on a diverse range of forms of historical writing, from historiographic commentaries to academic articles to fora to document studies, and those things. And there's even more, but to show that the writing of history can and should take a diverse range of forms. And we, as tooting our own horn a little bit, but one of the best journals in the country, we as one of the best journals in the country are going to walk that walk. We're going to take a generous approach to our colleagues. We're going to encourage scholarship. We're going to attempt to promote the work of new scholars, and we're going to show the diversity of
Yeah.
the ways in which you can write history. And all of those things, I think, are something that make that journal particularly special.
Yeah. Well, we have the journal has monthly editorial team meetings, and the encouragement of emerging scholars, and getting emerging scholars to have material that comes out in the journal is always at the forefront of our conversations, every month. So
I'm so glad to hear that, and it occurs to me, I should say, like, this podcast is another example of how Acadiensis is doing that, so kudos to you.
well, our ultimate goal is to be able to influence elections with this podcast, much like they do in the States, because we're talking about the the hardships that are facing universities.
Yeah.
This is our inside job. We grow the podcast, then we start to influence elections, and then funding starts flowing to the universities once again.
I think that's a very laudable thing, and I
Yeah.
do certainly hope our premiers are listening.
Yeah, we're playing the long game here, Andrew.
It is a long game for sure.
All right. Well, speaking of long games, we're fast approaching the CHA conference,
Yeah.
which you are the organizer for,
I'm
essentially.
I'm the program chair,
Program chair.
and we've got the program is out, and we've got a great, I'd like to believe we have a great program, but I think we've also had a great committee. I know I leaned on you to do some work for putting that program together in terms of reviewing submissions. I really appreciate that. This is the largest program we've had in ages, which I think speaks to the vitality of history right now.
Yeah. I was
And I,
going to ask if this is the biggest program that we've ever had at the CHA, because I've been attending the CHA since the late 90s,
Mhm.
and I don't recall anything as big as this.
I don't either, and, I had asked, kudos to Catherine Charlton, the, executive coordinator of the CHA, who does, just a ton of the legwork. So what you see is just a ton of work on her part. But yeah, I think we might be not just bigger, but significantly bigger than any, CHA in the last several decades. And there's a couple of themes within that, but also too, like the members of the program committee, all of whom are listed in the program, and Lisa Chilton at UPEI, who's head of the local committee, has done so much work. And also two big shout outs to James Moran and Tom Larkin, who have been really helpful, and a whole bunch of other people from Ray Blake to Penny Bryden, to Martha Walls, to Aaron Spinney, who did so much work reviewing the submissions and making decisions. What we're seeing in terms of the program itself, the submissions were actually much larger, and it's unfortunate that decisions had to be made, but we did have to go through a peer review process to make those decisions, and then putting together a program that size just takes forever. And it was incredibly long. What we could say is, one, yes, speaks to the vitality. Two, we're seeing a ton of work on Indigenous history, and that is incredibly good to see. We're seeing a lot of work on public history. That is great to see. We're collaborating with the Atlantic Canada Studies Conference, Josh McFadden and others. Kudos to them. I love the idea of collaborating, having the CHA collaborate with Atlantic Canada Studies and also the Canadian Catholic Historical Association. So all of that is really good. And we're seeing a lot of non-university based historians, people working in museums, Parks Canada, in the private sector who are involved. And these were some of our objectives in putting this conference together, was to reach beyond the academy and to try to bring people back to the CHA, the Canadian Historical Association, after membership had collapsed during COVID, right? That there was a significant decline. And then finally, again, in terms of thinking about how do you talk about, present history, in addition to papers, roundtables, keynotes, Ed McDonald's giving the keynote, grateful to him.
Yeah.
That we have a poster session for the first time in ages. We have workshops. Stephen Dutcher, formerly with Acadiensis, is giving a workshop on treaty education, and there's a bunch of others. And we have pedagogical sessions for the first time in a long time. So we've really tried to broaden both those who feel they're part of history and the ways in which you can communicate history.
That's great. And I know that you're still holding on to some of the traditional aspects of the CHA conference, like Cleopalooza.
I have very little to do with Cleopalooza. I will say that. I don't know if you're going.
I
Uh,
know.
I wouldn't want anybody to see me dance.
No, I'd just be standing around like all the time, just wishing that they played 99 Luftballons
Yeah,
so I
that's
could leave after.
I'd be having bad flashbacks to high school.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, like, a-ha playing, or it's like something like that. Yeah, Nina and Thompson twins, or I don't know
Oh,
what.
yeah, that would be really good. That would be a good Cleopalooza. No, I thought about going, but I missed the window on tickets, and Martha and I will be attending with our daughter, and I don't think
That's
she'd
cool.
be too into our daughter wouldn't be very into a loud night of rock music.
No,
So
no. I mean, and who knows? I might also be one of those people who's getting to a point where they need to get to bed at a certain time too.
you are going to be exhausted, I'm sure,
Yeah.
by the end of the day of the conference.
Yeah. And again, without wanting to forget anybody too, I would also say that the CHA president, Colin Coates, and past president, our colleague Don Wright, works with us on the on Acadiensis, um, have both been great and supportive of what's going on.
Okay. Now, you talked about your time at Acadiensis. You did 5 years as one of the co-editors of the journal.
Mhm.
What would be the highlight of that period of time? Is there anything that strikes you as something that you're particularly proud of that you did over that period of time, or something? Yeah. Is there anything
Yeah.
that really resonates?
So one of the things I like to think that we can do at different points in time in our career is to help build the infrastructure of what makes scholarship possible. And that can be a real challenge. Particularly in times where resources are shrinking. But a lot of what we were doing, and then other editors have certainly continued this and deepened it and enriched it, was to alter the journal in ways that sort of modernized it in terms of its look and feel, that where having things that you brought in, like the blog, like this podcast, social media campaigns, like building that infrastructure are things that I would look at, and being able to secure in a difficult situation the financial resources that made it possible. There and then the other thing that I would look back at, that I would say I wouldn't say this was me, but one of the things that I would say that was so important during that time and that has continued is the collegial approach to this, that we're all on the same side and we're all working towards an end goal. So those were sort of my takeaways, would be, how do you build infrastructure to sustain scholarship that is not dependent on something or somebody else, right? That can retain its independence. And how do you modernize without abandoning your traditions?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point, 'cause I think you can look at the modern iteration of the journal, right? And you can see the direct link to the original
Yeah.
issues in the early '70s. Like, it's the same journal. But there's also a lot that's new, a lot that's different. The thematic approaches that people take to the past have changed. We have different areas now that we've expanded into, like you mentioned, the blog and in this podcast now. So it is a that's an excellent observation about, the journal's the same, but and you can see that tie to the past, but it is constantly evolving. And I agree with you that everything is being done so collegially. Like, it is a great group of people over the years to have been involved with.
And that doesn't occur by accident. I was head of Canadian studies here at Mount Allison for 15 years or something like that, on and off. It wasn't like in a row. But one of the things that I began by saying, I don't want to take votes. There's certain things that we have to take votes on because of our collective agreement, and rightly so, right? That you need to have approval to hire somebody, right? And you can't have an administrator somewhere else, or a dean, or something like that. And I've been a dean, saying, I'm going to make the department do something it doesn't want to do. We can't have those kinds of things. But I was quite proud of the fact that we used a consensus model for the entire time that I was head, that we would record votes, but we didn't actually ever have to take them, because we took the time to talk through things and make sure everybody was in agreement. And if people had concerns, we slowed down until those concerns were addressed.
Yeah.
And I think Acadiensis, like I said, it doesn't happen by accident, that people it was built by people like David Frank. It was built by Phil Buckner, by Sheila Andrews, by Gail Campbell. And those people put a ton of work. It wasn't an accident that journal was so dynamic and so engaging. And Bill Parenteau and Stephen Dutcher. And then since then, with Aaron Morton and Suzanne Morton and Sasha Malawi, John Reed, Peter Twohig, those things are not just occurring.
Yeah.
Patrick Noel.
Yeah. Yeah, Greg Marquis, Michael Boudreau, like, there's so many people that have been part of this process. And and you're right that we have had, as we can have disagreements about the direction of the journal or what we should do, but they've never been fiery or heated. They've just been conversations between people who might have different opinions about what's best or what isn't. And like you said, we generally come to a consensus and move forward.
We always did, and people accepted even when they might disagree. I can look back and I can say, I think, there was I don't think John Reed and I on one side and David Frank on the other ever agreed on anything. Right? Like, we were always seeing things from different perspectives, right? And I'll
Yeah.
leave John out of it even because he's more than capable of speaking for himself, but certainly David and I had lots of things, tons of things we disagreed on, right? From, like, how do you put the numbers? What should the numbers look like for the volume and issue?
Mhm.
How should the database function? All those kinds of questions. And, what should be the design of the cover or what have you? We disagreed on just like every detail you can possibly think of to disagree on. And yet it didn't make a difference in terms of the continuity of the journal, making sure it was out, ensuring that we continued our approach to emerging scholars and different ways of writing about the past.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned you wanted to talk about teaching.
I did.
I know that in the last in recent years, you've been at the forefront of teaching and pedagogy, and that's become a real interest of yours. Uh, Not that I don't think it sounds like it always has been, but you've been given the opportunity now to more fully explore that part of the job of being a professor. Um, just wonder if you wanted to talk a bit about your philosophy of teaching and the approaches that you take to instruction.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about our gig, we're working in the academy, is that you can change jobs without changing your employer, as it were, right? And so, as I said, I ran the Center for Canadian Studies for an extended period of time. It had a big outreach component to it, and we organized lots of public events and readings and symposia and conferences and things like that, and worked on that infrastructure of scholarship, and that was wonderful. I ran an academic program and was teaching in it for an extended period of time, and I ran a teaching center for 3 years, and that allowed me to interact because I had some interest in it and I had some really positive mentors and role models and that I was in an institution that cared about instruction, that instruction and teaching was part of what Mount Allison saw as its mandate and its mission. And that was different. Years ago, I remember I was writing a letter of support for a colleague at another institution who was being tenured. They were up for tenure, and I was talking to the department head, and I asked him. I said, "Do you want me to comment on his teaching?" And the head said, "That would be novel." Right? Like, nobody does here. And I said, "Well, how do you make determinations?" And he said, "Quite frankly, we count publications." And so I like the idea that I'm in a place where that's not the only thing that's done. It's still
Yeah.
done, but it's not the only thing that's done. And the scholarship of teaching and learning is another area where we have advances. And as a historian, I've been thinking about what does it mean to say advances, achievements, and things like that, since every era is supposedly equidistant to God, right? So what does it mean to say that? And I'd like to get a group of historians together sometime and do a forum on whether or not you can have achievements, whether or not you can have advances, improvements in history, because some of our British colleagues, for example, have no problem saying that, right? Whereas as we tend to. Um, so scholarship, teaching, and learning. I won a teaching award, and I didn't know why is sort of, because I thought I was just doing what other people did. I was trying to be generous. I was trying to be friendly, but not a friend, those kinds of things. And so after winning the award, I then started looking into the scholarship of teaching and learning and saying, well, is there a way to make a contribution to this? Now I'll recruit a little bit. I'm also a member of the Canadian Historical Association's Teaching and Learning Committee, and we do publish a regular blog on teaching and learning. We're running a series on AI right now, and
I
I've
saw
got to
that.
get another one. Yeah, we've got another one that'll be out soon. But I'm going to be interested in recruiting some other things too, and talking to people about, even if it's like a firsthand account. One of the blogs on AI as a firsthand account from a graduate teaching assistant about how disappointed they were that they thought they had this wonderful relationship with their students, and then their students were using a percentage of their students were sort of using AI, and how they felt kind of betrayed and things like that. And I was like, I've been there. We've all been there, right? It's your heart sinks when you catch somebody plagiarizing, and it
Yeah.
feels like almost like it's not, but it feels almost like a personal betrayal. And so I started looking into this literature and thinking about questions like, why do students cheat? There's no manifest reason to cheat, right? There's no manifest reason to plagiarize. If a student's having problems, they come to your office, you sit down with them, you talk them through it. Most of us are remarkably flexible in terms of their due dates. I have flex days built
Yeah.
into my syllabus. You do too, right? And most of our colleagues do. Most of us provide some measure of choice and innovative assignments, whether they're podcasts. I mentioned to you when we were talking last week a student of mine who made a quilt based on archival research. And so and students making documentary films and those kinds of things. So that I was starting to think, like, why is somebody doing this? What motivates somebody to sort of step outside the boundaries? And that led into a series of literatures. And Mari Cowan and I wrote a piece in the handbook, in one of the Rutledge handbooks on plagiarism and historical methods. And I think it's really important to do that. And then we've tried to follow this up, myself and my colleagues, with a couple of areas, and I'll be really, really quick. A couple of areas. One is on students and having a happy ending, seeing the history ending in a positive way. And I don't know about you, and we've talked briefly about this in the past, but my students want a happy ending. Like, they want the last unit to be the history has led in the right direction. And so in one of my courses, which is a history of neoliberalism, as it were, it ends on a very dark note. It's going to get even darker, I think, but it used to end with a unit on foreign policy, recent foreign policy changes in Canadian mining companies in the third world. And I was like, there's no happy ending here. These people are exploiting the environment, harming indigenous populations, and replicating the colonialism in Canada that we see in Canada about us today. And students were like, well, there must be something good here.
Yeah.
And so we've been looking at a little bit at that, about what that means and why people do that. And then the other thing, I've got a group of people that I work with, Tony Roberts, Moira Law, Acadiensis, and we work on a concept called mattering, and that students who believe they matter to other people, and there's a definition of mattering, which is reciprocal, right? That I count for somebody else and they count for me, kind of thing. Those students actually do better. Mattering is uneven. It's racialized, it's gendered, and things like that. But students who matter, and this makes sense to me because we want to matter in other people's lives, actually have higher success ratios, however we define that in school, better mental health outcomes, right? So that they're not thrown for the loops that we're seeing many undergraduate students being thrown for as they integrate. And so we're looking at ways in which institutions can enact forms of caring that are reciprocal, but which allow students who otherwise would have failed or dropped out to have the opportunity to stay, to have grades where they have more choices than they otherwise would have. We don't want to tell anybody to do something they don't want to do, but we would, as a social justice issue, like to see this evened out with regard to indigenous populations, racialized populations, to provide more options and choices for students.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot of stuff to think about there, Andrew. Your point about students wanting something that's uplifting reminds me of I read somewhere William Cronin talking about the first ever environmental history course that he taught, and at the end of it, students complained because it was so relentlessly depressing. And he revised the course so that the last class was like an uplifting class, all about the like environmental successes, and it was sort of like a call to arms for students to, your actions and your opinions are important, and you can affect the change that you want to see. So
I'm trying to do something similar, but I remember Ian MacKay saying something like similar to that too, in teaching about regional economic underdevelopment and having a group of students go, "Well, I guess there is no hope." Right? And he was like, "No, that's not the message you should take from this." But they heard him loud and clear.
Uh,
Yeah.
they just throw up their hands and leave.
Yeah,
Everything's hopeless. I'm done.
right, because he has that sort of structuralist dynamic to his
Yeah.
work, right? And they were like, "Yeah, yeah, it is. Yep, we're screwed. We can't. There's nothing we can do about it. We've got it."
It's sort of
And,
like, yeah, the Atlantic Canadian version of the end of history.
yeah, it is.
Nothing you can do. Better just leave. Um,
Exactly. Migrate.
down the road, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
um, I don't know if there's anything else that we want to cover here.
I
Is there anything else you want to say?
I don't know if there's anything else I want to say or should say. We were also kicking around the idea of like a favorite book. What's your favorite book?
My favorite history book.
Yeah.
Um, one book I always enjoyed, and it's not really an Atlantic Canadian book, is John Damos's The Unredeemed Captive.
Okay.
And I remember reading about how he wrote it in response to I forget the term he used, but basically analytical history. And he
Yep.
wanted to show that a narrative could still be good and effective history. And we're talking, I think that book's like 30 some years
Yeah.
old now. But it's just it's a thoroughly researched, well-written story that's grounded in the historical literature, and I've always enjoyed that book. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent, right? And as part of my own reading, I'm always reading a classic work, right? So there's
yeah,
research that you're doing, and then I always try to pull an older book off my shelf and always be reading. And then it could be, I recently reread Roll Jordan Roll,
yeah,
we certainly would not say the same things that Gene Genovese said about slavery, but I was attempting to talk to my students actually about how slavery, because my students is sort of following more critical trends, saw an intermeshing of slavery and capitalism. And I was trying to say, well, actually within the Marxian framework, there's a tradition that sees this as a different mode of production, that where you can have an uneven sort of social formation of different modes of production within it, but it doesn't actually see this as capitalistic, and right, it creates a different set of social relations. And so that was really engaging to read. And then sort of I've tried to continue it since then. And not all of them are history books. And I was trying to think of like what might have been a book that had the most influence. I really love Joy Parr's The Gender of Breadwinners.
yeah,
That was a really, really exciting book. To give our colleagues their due, Ray Blake's Lions and Jellyfish,
great
just
book.
yeah, just a really fabulous book. But if there were a single book that I would look at that I would say, yeah, this is a book that I often went back to. Again, not a Canadian book. It was Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts into Air. And that idea that the modern age, the modern world that we have creates a world that is forever unable to stabilize, that we remain ambiguous and undetermined, and that the best intentions of people take on ironic implications and end up being destructive. There's a part in that book where Berman is retelling Goethe's Faust as a fable of development. And as we know, Faust calls up Mephistopheles, and at one point in time asks him, Faust is attempting to build the city on the sea as a beacon of civilization and caring and enlightenment and things like this that will protect rogue seafarers and all kinds of things. And there's a little old couple that won't sell their house to complete so he can complete his city by the sea. And Faust calls up Mephistopheles and says, get rid of this couple for me. And so Mephistopheles and the demons kill the couple. And Faust says to Mephistopheles, this isn't what I meant. And Mephistopheles says, yes, it was. And that moment, I was like, okay, this is, we got to, like, if I could write something like that causes people to pause, I would be really happy. I was walking down the hall the other day. I had a John Krakauer book with me,
Yeah,
Into Thin Air or something like that. And it was Into Thin Air,
good
actually.
book.
Yeah, I thought it was a great book. And one of a colleague who shall remain nameless was walking the other way and said, oh, Do you read that?" And I can remember thinking, if I could write a book this bad, I'd be really, really happy. Like, if I could write a New York Times bestseller and people think it sucks, I'll walk away.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one time talking with Marg Conrad about, like, things
Mm,
that we read, and I was like, it was almost like I was apologizing because I was reading I don't know if it was Dan Brown or something like that, like an airport sort of novel for a flight. And she was going like she about how she would read stuff like that. You have a certain amount of time and you don't want to engage yourself
yeah.
intellectually. You want to read for entertainment. So why not?
Exactly, exactly. There's lots of fun stuff out there, and you can learn something along the way. And
Yeah.
were there any other books or anything else you wanted to talk about? Any things about
Oh,
teaching that are important to you?
important. Well, I think one of the things that's important to me that I think is important in teaching is you got to get students to realize that they're doing this for their own good.
Mm,
Like, and I remember having a conversation with one of my colleagues, and when you were talking about AI and things like that, I was thinking, and I'm not sure how much I'm committed to this idea, but the idea of grading, right? They're
mhm,
using AI because they need to get a higher grade, and a C is worse than a B, which is worse than an A. So they feel that this is the tool to get them an A. But if you got rid of grading and it was just about how much personal growth do you get from this? What skills have you learned in the process of writing this essay or making this short film or recording this podcast? What are the skills that you've learned over this process? And you know, not what is the grade I would assess you on this.
yeah.
That maybe that is the way to get students to be more invested in their educations. But that means that we're sort of reworking the whole premise of a lot of what we do at universities, isn't it? Doesn't it?
It absolutely, and we know, like, among the things that we think we know, and I would agree with it, we do know some of these things, is that when we ask students later, after they've left university, what was the most important thing, they almost always talk about individual faculty, not what they learned, right? That they look back and say, this person, did this person did that, this person did the other thing. So there's a human dynamic in it that in terms of personal growth, that if we could find a way to function on that pedagogical relationship level without the rest of the artifice, it would be
Yeah.
really good. I do try to tell students that I recognize grades are really important to them, right? And I know I sort of talked a little bit about things that I like about teaching or things that I do, and dodged the question a bit on my own philosophy. And my teaching philosophy is always changing, but I lean very heavily in terms of what I'm doing on the sort of new left activist intellectuals like Isaac Deutscher and Edward Thompson and Perry Anderson, Alan Miskins Wood. People like that would be the people that I would turn to again and again and again and say, like, how did they do these kinds of things? How did they engage these kinds of issues? And so building effective relationships with knowledge and acknowledging to students that I understand where you're coming from, right? That education is much more expensive than it used to be. The labor market seems amazingly uncertain, right? You're concerned about what happens next. So how can we find a way? And I'd like to try to have these conversations directly with students as opposed to guessing at it or things like that, to say, like what would make this course meaningful for you? And I had one answer. I'm going to give that answer, that changed the way a course actually functioned. And it was a first year course, and we'd actually had to add another sort of tutorial discussion group. And I was running it because we had more students than we knew what to do with at that point in time. And more was over cap, and we didn't want to turn students away. And so I'm sitting around on a Friday morning with a group of 21st year students, and we're talking, or what I think are 21st year students. We're talking about introduce yourselves, those standard kind of things, and tell me why you're here. And almost everybody said, I'm here because I have to go get a job. I need a higher education, those kinds of things. The other tutorials were full, which didn't make me feel great. Those kinds of questions. But halfway through, there's a student and she says, I'm a fourth year physics student. I'm really, really happy with my knowledge of physics. I think I've gotten a good education here at Mount Allison University. I was home at Christmas time and I was talking to my father and my older sister, and I thought we elected prime ministers the same way Americans elected presidents. And they laughed at me.
Yeah.
And I left the conversation, went out, started looking, and suddenly realized I'm about to be a fully functioning adult in a democratic society that I know nothing about. And I changed what I was doing. And I thought, that's such a great rationale. The grade no longer matters to you. I think it actually did matter to her, but the grade no longer matters as much. And then once she said it, then other students were able to say, look, I remember one guy said, can I revise my answer? I was being flippant. I was trying to sound cool, right? When I kind of blew you off, and I'll apologize for it and come back. And so that's the kind of conversation that I like to have or try to have with students at different levels of their education. Now, it works better at an upper level where students have some things behind them. And I teach a third year sort of environmental history, eco-criticism kind of interdisciplinary course. And same thing last year, where why are you in this course? And there's a young guy who I've led into the course, a male student, who has no background in the course. He's actually a biology student. And he grew up in St. Andrews with family friends of a local leader in the Passamaquoddy Nation. And he had been fascinated with the differences in approaches to environment between settler society and indigenous people. He didn't have the language to explain it, but he decided that rather than just go and take some first year course for his humanities course, he wanted something that helped him understand the historical trajectories of the environment and the processes of displacement of indigenous people. And when you hear those things, you're like, wow, that's really great.
Yeah. Now that'd be sort of the ideal situation where you have students coming into your classes and they know why they want to be there. And they're
Yeah,
not just there because, like we were saying earlier, it's a class that's running from, this might have been before we started recording, a class that's from 9 till 10 on a Tuesday, right?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Which I often have. I often have 8:30 to 10 actually is Tuesday mornings is one of the times I teach, although I believe my head moved me out of that because of complaints this
Yeah.
year. Uh,
Well, I was during my undergrad, I was like my first couple years, I was a horrible student. And it's
oh,
because I was picking classes according to like, I wanted to sleep in. So I'll maybe have an 11 till 12 class. And then I'm picking stuff I didn't really care about. And then I took a year off, uh,
okay.
and returned. And when I went back, I thought, I don't care what time it's at. If it's something I'm interested in, I'll take the class and I'll go to it. And that's sort of where I found Atlantic Canadian history because, um, because I'm from Ontario, and it was so neat to take classes with at Carleton Carmen Bickerton and Del Muse,
Mm,
and to get this, growing up, and you probably saw this when you were at Queen's, like the media of Ontario makes it seem that whatever's good for Ontario is good for the country.
yeah. Yeah.
And then I'm taking classes where I'm learning like all of these things that I was taught are good for Canada. People in the Maritimes are like, this isn't good for us.
That's, I'll get you here out of here on this.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sportscasters, Mike Wilbon. That's one of his expressions. We'll get you out of here on this. But I was teaching when my wife was going to law school. I was teaching a night course at the university that she was at, and it was in Ontario. And at the end of the course, you're just having a roundup and things like that. And one of the students, like, what did you think of the course? And constructive criticism. And one of the students says, I didn't realize that everything of any importance whatsoever that ever happened in Canada happened in Atlantic Canada until I took this course. And I said, I didn't say that. He goes, well, when we looked at labor issues, it was 1920s in Cape Breton. When we looked at colonialism, it was the peace and friendship treaties. When we looked at the suffrage, right? It was the Ernie Forbes's piece on another war, and it occurred to me I had made up a Canadian course that was entirely about Atlantic Canada with sort of I think there's like a reference or two to Louis Riel in there and things like that, but I had just made it up. right? I had to set out to do it.
I had this vision of you talking about the Winnipeg General Strike, but focusing only on Sydney or something like
I was
that.
I think I might have even said the more important one occurred in Amherst, which of
Yeah.
course was flippant. But when I did say, "Ah, there's a national strike wave, but we're going to look at the process of strikes." And as we all know, the best place to look at the process of strikes where labor conflict arises is Cape Breton. And so off we go. I mean, I'm sure something happened in Hamilton or Montreal too, but it struck me as sort of a great example of bias, right? That without intending to do so, I sort of taught people what I knew, and what I knew was regional history. So the actual sort of reverse almost.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for this. We're now getting up to. I think we've been chatting for about an hour.
How are you?
It doesn't feel like it to me, but I don't know if we should keep on going. Our membership or our whatever our viewership, listenership,
Well,
might
yeah,
find an hour a bit long. So that was a lovely conversation. I really appreciate the time that you've given us. I have to say that I think that either you have the cleanest and nicest office at Mount A, or this is a home office that I'm looking at.
this is a home office. You can
Okay.
see my Montreal Expos paraphernalia there, and Blue
Yeah.
Jays stuff
Well,
over there. But yeah, I try to keep my office clean though.
well,
You have
I had to clean my office, but really I just cleaned the 30% of it that you can see behind me, and like it's chaos everywhere else that's not
yeah.
on camera. So
That's a way to do it. So
definitely.
thank you very much for doing these podcasts. I think this is a great addition, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they continue to roll out.
Yeah, well, same here. I'm interested to see what happens next as well. But seriously, Andrew, thank you for being here with us. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate, as always, chatting with you. It's always a pleasure.
You're welcome. You have yourself a great day, and I'll just click leave.
All right, I'm going to click stop. All right, thanks everybody for watching. Bye bye.
Bye bye.